My name is Samantha. If you've ever felt like your voice was a whisper in a room full of shouting, if you've ever been told your passion was pointless, then you need to hear my story. It might help to know you're not alone, that you're not just screaming into the void. So if this story resonates with you, if it feels familiar, let me know in the comments. Like this video and subscribe, because we're going to talk about how the quietest person in the room can sometimes make the most noise. For 5 years, I was a junior architect at Finch and Associates, a firm that worshipped at the altar of brutalism. Our God was raw concrete, our scripture was the right angle, and our creed was that the past was a footnote, best erased to make way for the future. Our senior partner, Mr. Harrison Finch, was the high priest of this religion. He was a man who saw history not as a foundation to build upon, but as a flaw in the landscape, a weed to be pulled. He moved through the world with the kind of confidence that only comes from never once questioning your own beliefs. To him, buildings were objects, simple declarations of power cast in steel and glass. He designed structures that looked like they were at war with the sky. My passion, my expertise, was historical preservation. It was the thing that got me out of bed in the morning, and the reason I'd gone to architecture school in the first place. I believed that buildings had souls, that they held the memories of a city within their walls. I saw stories in worn stone and character in aged brick. To Mr. Finch, this was not just a differing professional opinion, it was a character flaw. He called it my sentimental nonsense. He would say it in meetings, with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if swatting away a fly. Samantha and her sentimental nonsense are at it again. The words were always delivered with a thin, condescending smile that never reached his cold, gray eyes. He made my love for history sound like a childish hobby, like collecting dolls or pressing flowers. It was a public and constant belittlement. He didn't just disagree with my ideas, he ridiculed the very core of who I was as an architect. The firm's business model was simple and brutal: buy historical properties, often in prime locations, secure demolition permits through aggressive lobbying, and replace them with monolithic, glass and concrete towers that were as profitable as they were soulless. For every project, my job was to draw up the initial surveys, to document the very structures we were slated to destroy. It was a slow, methodical heartbreak. I would walk through these old buildings, a 19th-century textile mill, with soaring archways, a pre-war theater with the ghosts of applause still clinging to the velvet seats, a block of brownstones with intricate ironwork, and I would feel like an executioner's assistant, measuring the victim for the gallows. But I did something else, in secret. After my official work was done, I would go back to my small apartment, to the glow of my personal laptop, and I would work for myself. For every project, for every building condemned by Finch's relentless modernism, I drafted a second set of blueprints, an alternative, a ghost portfolio. In my designs, the old wasn't destroyed, it was embraced. I'd weave a glass atrium through the iron trusses of the old mill. I'd restore the theater's grand proscenium arch and make it the dramatic centerpiece of a new residential complex. I would design sleek, modern extensions that flowed from the original brownstones like a river, creating a conversation between the 19th and 21st centuries. It wasn't about revenge, not then. It was an act of personal defiance. It was my way of keeping my own soul intact. It was the only way I could stand the sound of the wrecking ball in my head. Then came the Argent Tower. It wasn't a tower, not really. It was a beautiful 8-story Art Deco masterpiece from the 1920s, a beloved landmark, known for its intricate terracotta facade and its iconic clock face that had watched over the city center for nearly a century. The city council, under immense pressure from developers, had controversially removed its landmark status, citing a bogus technicality about it not being continuously occupied for 100 years, a rule that sounded official, but that no one had ever heard of before. It was a flimsy excuse, a legal loophole greased with money. Finch and Associates snapped it up immediately. The plan was, of course, demolition. In its place, Finch envisioned the monolith, a 50-story black glass behemoth that would cast a literal shadow over the entire district. When the plans were made public, the city erupted. It was a firestorm. Community groups, historians, and ordinary citizens who had grown up under the gaze of the Argent's clock organized protests. The media backlash was swift and brutal. Our firm, once just an obscure name in the architectural world, was now the villain in a city-wide drama. Investors, spooked by the negative press and the ferocity of the public outcry, started pulling their funding. The monolith project, Finch's magnum opus, was hemorrhaging money and public support. The firm was teetering on the brink of collapse. I remember the emergency board meeting. The air in the conference room was thick with panic. The mood was funereal. Finch, for the first time, looked small. His usual booming confidence had shrunk to a defensive, brittle anger. He paced the room, blaming the Luddite public, the spineless media, and the weak-kneed investors. His solution was to declare strategic bankruptcy, dissolve the firm, and start over under a new name once the dust settled. He was ready to burn it all down. His own creation. He was going to demolish his own company, just as he'd planned to demolish the Argent. I watched him, my heart hammering against my ribs. For years, I had been the quiet one, the one with the sentimental nonsense. I had absorbed his condescension, his dismissiveness, his quiet professional cruelty. I had swallowed my pride and my anger and channeled it into my work, into my secret portfolio. And now, in this room, as our world was collapsing, I realized something. He had a plan to destroy. I had a plan to build. My hand was shaking slightly as I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It wasn't company property. I had bought it myself. I had filled it myself. I walked to the head of the long, polished table and placed it down. The sound it made in the silent room was a soft, solid thud. It was the sound of a foundation being laid. Finch stopped pacing. He stared at the portfolio, then at me, his eyes narrowing with confusion and contempt. "What is this, Samantha? More of your little drawings?" The entire board turned to look at me. In that moment, I wasn't the junior architect anymore. I was the only person in the room with a lifeline. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than I thought it would be, "Mr. Finch is right. The firm as we know it is finished, but he is mistaken about why. It's not because the public is sentimental. It's because we've forgotten that architecture is a public trust. He has offered you a way to end the company. I am here to offer you a way to save it." I opened the portfolio. The first page was a stunning rendering of my vision for the Argent Tower. The old Art Deco structure wasn't gone. It was the heart of the new design, its terracotta facade lovingly restored, its clock ticking once more. Rising from its core and stepping back from the original structure was a graceful, modern glass tower, one that complemented the old building instead of erasing it. It was beautiful, it was bold, and it was possible, and it was just the beginning. The fallout was a slow, creeping poison. After the initial shock of the public backlash over the Argent Tower, the atmosphere at Finch and Associates curdled. The usual confident swagger of the senior partners was replaced by a tense, brittle paranoia. Phone calls were taken in hushed tones behind closed doors. The hiss of the espresso machine in the break room sounded like a pressure valve about to blow. Mr. Finch, who had always commanded the office like a general, now stalked the halls like a caged animal. His anger needed a target, and in the absence of the anonymous public he so despised, it settled on his own staff. Every design flaw in every past project was suddenly someone else's fault. Deadlines were pulled forward to impossible schedules. The pressure was immense, a physical weight in the air. I retreated into my work, my head down, my demeanor as neutral as the gray carpet. But inside I was a wreck. The private breakdown came not with a crash, but with a quiet, hollow ache. I was sitting in my car late one night in the office parking garage, long after everyone else had gone home. The only light came from a single flickering fluorescent tube overhead, casting long, distorted shadows. I was staring at the concrete wall in front of me, a perfect, brutalist canvas of Finch's making, and I just felt tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. It was the weight of 5 years of being minimized, of having my passion treated as a liability. I thought of the Argent Tower, its elegant lines and proud clock, and the thought of it being reduced to a pile of rubble felt like a personal loss, a death in the family. I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel, the plastic cool against my skin, and for a moment I allowed the despair to wash over me. What was I even doing? Fighting a battle no one else even knew was being waged, for a cause my own boss considered a joke. It felt futile, it felt sentimental, and for the first time, I wondered if he was right. My mind drifted back. Flashbacks aren't like in the movies. They don't come in a neat chronological montage. They're shards of memory, popping up unbidden, sharp and painful. I was 26, fresh out of my master's program, my portfolio filled with ambitious designs that merged historical reverence with modern aesthetics. Finch & Associates was my first real job. I remember my first major project meeting. We had acquired a row of 19th-century warehouses on the waterfront. The plan was to level them for a luxury condo complex. I had stayed up all night, working on an alternate concept. I suggested we could keep the original brick facades and the massive timber beams, integrating them into loft-style apartments. I was so nervous, my voice barely a squeak. Finch didn't even let me finish. He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. He turned to the other senior architects. "Gentlemen, it seems we've hired a historical reenactor." He didn't look at me again for the rest of the meeting. The heat that flushed up my neck that day was a feeling I would come to know well: humiliation. It became a background radiation to my daily life at the firm. Another memory surfaced. A project 2 years ago, a small historic bank building. The client, a boutique hotel chain, was surprisingly keen on preserving the original neoclassical facade. Finch, smelling a prestigious contract, agreed, but he had no idea how to do it. His team's initial drafts were clumsy, a modern box awkwardly stapled onto a classical front. The client was unimpressed. Quietly, I was tasked with fixing it. I spent a week digging through city archives, found the original 1912 blueprints, and designed a seamless, elegant transition between the old and new structures. My solution was subtle, respectful, and structurally brilliant. I gave the plans to Finch. He presented them as his own. The client was thrilled. At the celebration dinner, Finch stood up and gave a speech about his personal vision for the project. He talked about his innate understanding of architectural dialogue. He never mentioned my name. I sat at the back of the room, sipping my water, invisible. It wasn't about the credit, I told myself then. It was about saving the building. But that was a lie I told myself to survive. It was about the credit. It was about the erasure. This is why I stayed. It's a question I know people will ask. Why endure it for 5 years? The logic is debatable, I know. But the emotional reason was clear to me. I wasn't just loyal to the firm. I was loyal to the idea of the firm, to what it could be. I believed in its resources, its potential to shape the city. I thought, perhaps naively, that I could change it from the inside. That if I just worked hard enough, if my designs were just good enough, eventually, my value would have to be recognized. It was a misplaced loyalty, a strategic miscalculation based on the flawed premise that a meritocracy existed within those concrete walls. I was playing chess, but I didn't realize the king was a cheater. The secret portfolio had started as that first act of defiance after the warehouse meeting. A single file on my personal hard drive labeled alternatives. Then it became a folder. Then it became a passion project. It was my real work. The work at Finch & Associates was just the day job that paid for my real work. I became a scholar of the condemned. I'd use our site surveys to run my own discrete LiDAR scans, capturing every detail of a building's structure. I'd spend my weekends in the city's Historical Society archives, poring over original drawings and photographs. I taught myself new software for photogrammetry and 3D modeling, creating intricate digital twins of these buildings before they were turned to dust. It was during one of these archival deep dives that I first met Elias Vance. He was the city's unofficial historian, a sharp, passionate man in his late 60s, with a tweed jacket and an encyclopedic knowledge of every cornerstone and cornice in town. I was examining the original plans for an old firehouse we were slated to demolish. He came over, curious. He saw the level of detail I was studying. Most developers just want the lot dimensions, he'd said, his eyes twinkling. You're looking at the soul of the place. We talked for an hour. He was impressed by my knowledge, and I was in awe of his. He became an unwitting mentor, a guiding star. He was the one who was now leading the public charge to save the Argent Tower. He was the external validator I didn't even know I had. My most important ally, however, was on the inside. Marcus Thorne. He was the head of structural engineering, a man in his 50s who had been with the firm since its inception. Marcus was quiet, pragmatic, and had a BS detector that was second to none. He was a man of numbers and load-bearing capacities, but he appreciated elegance and design. He'd seen Finch take credit for other people's work for 2 decades. He saw everything. A year or so ago, he'd caught me working late on one of my secret designs for a small art gallery. I thought I was in for a lecture about wasting time. He just stood behind me for a long moment, studying the screen. He pointed a calloused finger at a tricky join between a 100-year-old stone wall and a new steel beam. That's a clean transition, he'd said, his voice a low rumble. Most of the hotshots upstairs would have just bolted it on. You've made them talk to each other. He looked at me, a flicker of something, respect, maybe solidarity, in his eyes. You've got good bones, Sam. Don't let them grind you down. From that day on, he was my silent co-conspirator. I would show him my hypothetical designs, and he would give me off-the-record structural advice, pointing out weaknesses, suggesting stronger materials, validating my engineering instincts. He was adding his steel to my stone. The catalyst for action came on a Tuesday. The news was grim. Another major investor had pulled out. The firm was on life support. Finch called an all-hands meeting. He announced, with a defiant sneer, that we were not backing down. We were going to double down, fast-track the demolition permits for the Argent, and sue the city for lost revenue. It was a scorched earth policy. He was going to punish the city for its sentimentality. I felt a cold dread creep into my stomach. He wasn't just going to let the firm die. He was going to make it a martyr for his own ego. That evening my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. Board is meeting tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Finch is proposing a full dissolution. It's the end of the line. My heart pounded. This was it. The end of Finch and Associates. The end of my secret war. The end of any hope for the Argent Tower. I sat in my apartment, the secret blueprints for the Argent spread across my dining table. The beautiful rendering of my vision, the restored clock, the graceful new tower rising behind it, stared up at me. It was just a drawing, a fantasy, sentimental nonsense. Then another text from Marcus came through. They're looking for a parachute, Sam, not a gravestone. It's now or never. Something shifted inside me. The despair, the exhaustion. It didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It turned from a heavy fog into a sharp, cold point of light. A resolve. He was right. Finch was offering them a dignified suicide. But what if they were presented with an option for resurrection? All these years, I had been building lifeboats in secret, blueprints for survival. I had been saving these buildings on paper, one by one. But maybe, just maybe, I hadn't just been saving them. Maybe I had been saving us. It was never about revenge. It was about readiness. I had spent 5 years preparing for a moment I didn't even know was coming. I looked at the blueprints, then at my phone. I began to assemble my portfolio. I wasn't just bringing drawings. I was bringing a plan. I was bringing the future. The secret plan wasn't a single blueprint. It was an arsenal. It was a library of possibilities I had built in the shadows for 5 years. I call it a portfolio, but that word is too small, too gentle for what it was. It was a counter-narrative to the entire philosophy of Finch and Associates. On my dining room table, which had become my war room, lay the culmination of thousands of hours of unpaid, unseen labor. For each of the 17 historic sites we had either demolished or were slated to demolish, I had a complete, ready-to-present alternative. Each alternative was a triptych: the past, the present, and the future, bound together. The first panel of each triptych was the history. This wasn't just a sentimental nod, it was a forensic analysis. I had spent countless weekends at the city archives, my fingers dusty from handling century-old vellum blueprints. I'd read through old newspapers on microfiche, learning about the original architects, the builders, the first occupants. I'd commissioned historical photo restorations, bringing black and white images of these buildings in their prime to vivid life. For the Argent Tower, I had a detailed biography of its architect, a woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation to Elias, a fact I found poetic, who had been a pioneer of her time. I had testimonials from people whose parents had gotten married under its famous clock. I was building a case not just for the building's aesthetic value, but for its emotional equity, its place in the city's heart. The second panel was the blueprint. This was the core of my work, where my passion met my profession. Using the advanced 3D modeling software on my personal high-powered workstation, I had created what I called dialogic architecture. My designs didn't just preserve, they integrated. They didn't just add on, they conversed. For the Argent, my design restored the terracotta facade to its former glory, retrofitting it with modern energy-efficient materials that were invisible to the naked eye. The new tower wasn't a separate entity but grew organically from the original structure's foundations. I used setbacks and glass reflections to honor the Argent's profile, so from certain angles on the street, the new tower seemed to vanish, leaving only the classic silhouette against the sky. The clock was the jewel in the crown, its mechanism fully restored and tied into a smart building system that would subtly change the hue of the tower's accent lighting with the passing of the hours. It was a design that listened. The third and most crucial panel was the viability. This was my hidden leverage, the part that would speak to the soulless suits in the boardroom. For every project, I had a complete financial projection. I had researched the costs of demolition versus restoration. In many cases, especially with rising landfill taxes and the high cost of new structural steel, my integrated designs were surprisingly competitive. I sourced innovative materials, lightweight composites that mimicked historic masonry, self-healing concrete for foundations, specialized acoustic glass. I had built-in revenue models. The historic portions of the buildings would command premium rents from tenants who valued character, boutique firms, art galleries, high-end retail. The new portions offered modern efficiency. It was the best of both worlds, not a compromise. It was a superior product, and this is where my ally network became the steel frame for my architectural vision. I called Marcus Thorne late that night. I didn't waste time. Marcus, I have a way out, but I need your numbers. I need them now. There was no hesitation. Send me the models, he said. He knew exactly what I was asking for. For the next 3 hours, we worked in a silent digital dance. I sent him my 3D structural models. He, working from his home computer and using his personal copy of the engineering software, ran the load calculations, the stress tests, the wind shear analysis. He was borrowing the raw geotechnical data from the firm's servers, data that was technically company property, but we both knew that in a bankruptcy, it would all be lost anyway. He was salvaging it. By 2 a.m., he had sent me back a folder encrypted with a password we had once joked about. Good bones. Inside was a full set of structural verifications for my Argent Tower design, stamped with his own professional engineering credentials, not the firm's. He had taken a significant professional risk. He was putting his name next to mine. It was the ultimate vote of confidence. My next call was more delicate. I found the number for Elias Vance, the historian, through the website for the Argent Tower Preservation Society. I called him at what was an ungodly hour. I expected to get his voicemail. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert and wary. Mr. Vance, my name is Samantha Reed. I'm an architect at Finch & Associates. There was a cold silence on the other end of the line. I can imagine what you think of me, I said quickly, but I believe there might be a third way. A way to save the Argent and build something new. I'm not asking you to trust my firm. I'm asking for 10 minutes of your time tomorrow, before our board meeting. I could hear him thinking. The developers had been his sworn enemies. Why would one of their own be calling him? What kind of trick was this? What did you say your name was again? He asked. Samantha Reed. There was another pause. You're the one who was at the archives, looking at the firehouse plans. I remember you. You respected the material. That small moment of connection, months ago, was now a bridge. Be in the coffee shop, across from my office at 7 a.m., he said. You have 5 minutes. He hung up. The final piece of my hidden leverage was something I had been cultivating for years: my personal relationships with our subcontractors and material suppliers. Finch saw them as vendors to be squeezed. I saw them as partners. I knew the glaziers who were experimenting with smart glass, the masons who specialized in terracotta restoration, the engineers developing sustainable HVAC systems. I had built a network based on mutual respect and a shared passion for quality craftsmanship. I spent another hour composing a series of emails, drafting them to be sent later. They were quiet inquiries, asking for preliminary quotes and availability for a potential large-scale historic integration project. I was laying the groundwork for a supply chain that Finch didn't even know existed. By 5 a.m., the portfolio was complete. It wasn't just a collection of drawings. It was a fully fledged business plan. It had a historical soul, an architectural vision, a verified structural framework, a sound financial model, and the beginnings of a grassroots supply chain. It even had the implicit, if skeptical, ear of the man leading the public opposition. This was the part of my plan that was, I admit, a little questionable. Some might say I used company resources, the initial site surveys, the geotechnical data, but I saw it differently. I had used my own time, my own software, my own intellect, and my own money to create something of immense value. The firm was about to commit suicide. I wasn't stealing from the company. I was salvaging its most valuable assets from a sinking ship. The blueprints, the data, the potential, they were going to be flushed away in a bankruptcy proceeding. I was rescuing them. It wasn't about revenge against Finch. It was about preventing a monumental waste. A waste of a beautiful building, a waste of the firm's potential, and a waste of my 5 years of quiet, dedicated work. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale gray light over the city, I looked at the finished portfolio. It was heavy in my hands. It was the weight of 5 years of frustration, of being silenced, of being dismissed. But it was also the weight of my own conviction. Finch was going into that meeting with a plan to end things. He was bringing a eulogy. He was bringing a blueprint for a resurrection. He saw a dead end. I saw a cornerstone for a new beginning. I closed the leather cover. It was time to go to work. The coffee shop was one of those old-school places with worn linoleum floors, and the rich, dark smell of burnt coffee and sugar. It was exactly the kind of place Finch would have demolished without a second thought. Elias Vance was sitting in a corner booth, a half-empty mug in his hands. He looked tired but resolute, a soldier in a long war. He didn't offer a greeting, just a curt nod towards the seat opposite him. I sat down, my portfolio a heavy weight on my lap. "You have 5 minutes," he said, his eyes scanning me with deep-seated suspicion. I didn't waste a second. I opened the portfolio, not to the architectural drawings but to the historical analysis. I showed him the restored photo of Eleanor Vance, the original architect. I pointed out the details in her design that even he might have missed, subtle patterns in the terracotta that corresponded to constellations visible on the night the building was commissioned. His skepticism began to thaw, replaced by a flicker of professional curiosity. Then I showed him my design. I explained the concept of dialogic architecture, the conversation between old and new. I showed him how the new tower stepped back, preserving the sightlines of the original clock. I showed him the public atrium I had designed for the ground floor, incorporating the original grand entrance as a gateway to a new winter garden for the city. He was silent for a long time, tracing the lines of the rendering with his finger. This is not what I expected," he said slowly. "This respects the building. It doesn't just preserve it, it celebrates it. He looked up at me, his gaze sharp and analytical. Why haven't I seen this? Why is Finch trying to ram a glass box down our throats when he has this? Because he's never seen it, I said. This is my work. His plan is to demolish. My plan is to build. Elias leaned back, a complex expression on his face. He was a savvy operator. He understood power dynamics. He saw the play. You're planning a coup, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. I'm planning a rescue, I countered. The firm is voting to dissolve this morning. They think there's no other option. I'm going to give them one, but their decision will be driven by money and public opinion. I have the numbers. You have the public. He understood immediately. If the board sees your plan, and if they know that the very people leading the protests would champion this new design, it changes the entire equation. It turns their biggest liability into their greatest asset. Exactly, I said. He gave me a long, hard look. Then a slow smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a chess player who has just been shown a brilliant, unexpected move. All right, Miss Reed, he said. You have my attention. Go to your meeting. I'll make a few calls. Let's see if we can't give your Mr. Finch a bit of a surprise. I walked into the Finch and Associates boardroom at 9:05. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. The board members, a collection of gray-faced men in expensive suits, were scattered around the table, avoiding eye contact. Finch stood at the head, looking haggard but defiant. He was shuffling a stack of papers, the articles of dissolution. He saw me enter, and a flash of irritation crossed his face. Samantha, what are you doing here? This is a partners and board meeting only. I was invited, I said calmly. A board member, a quiet, older man named Mr. Abernathy, whom I knew Marcus respected, gave me a subtle nod. He was Marcus's contact. He had secured my invitation. I took an empty seat at the far end of the table, placing my portfolio in front of me. The first move in a silent takeover is always about presence. It's about occupying a space you're not expected to be in, and doing it with unshakable calm. My very presence was a disruption to Finch's narrative of orderly collapse. The meeting began. Finch launched into his speech. It was a tirade disguised as a business proposal. He painted a picture of a firm besieged by irrational forces, a victim of public ignorance. His solution was defeat, a strategic restructuring, which was a euphemism for firing everyone, selling the assets, and hiding the money in a new corporate shell. The board listened, their faces grim. They saw no other way out. They were ready to sign the death warrant. He finished his presentation. And now, I'll need a motion to approve the dissolution plan. That's when I stood up. Mr. Finch has presented you with a comprehensive plan for failure, I began. My voice was even, my hands steady on the portfolio. I'd like to present you with a plan for success. Finch's face, already pale, turned a mottled red. This is highly inappropriate. Samantha, this is not the time for your student projects. Mr. Abernathy interjected, his voice calm but firm. Let her speak, Harrison. We're about to vote to end this company. The least we can do is listen to an alternative, however unorthodox. The room was silent. All eyes were on me. The antagonist panic had begun. Finch was sputtering, his authority challenged in his own throne room, but Abernathy's quiet command had given me the floor. This was the moment. I didn't open with an emotional appeal. I opened with numbers. I walked them through the financial analysis of my Argent Tower proposal. I showed them the cost comparison, demolition and new construction versus restoration and integrated construction. My plan, with its lower initial material costs and tax incentives for historical preservation that I had researched, was actually 15% cheaper in the first phase. You could see a flicker of interest in their eyes. They were businessmen. They understood money. Then I showed them the design. I used the room's projector to display the 3D renderings. The images filled the wall. The restored Art Deco base, the graceful tower, the public winter garden. I showed them day and night simulations, the clock face glowing warmly, the building breathing with light. The room, which had been filled with the energy of a morgue, suddenly had a spark of life in it. "This is a fantasy," Finch stammered, his voice rising. "It's structurally impossible. The cost overruns on the restoration would be astronomical." He was flailing, resorting to bluster. "Actually, it's not," I said, turning a page in my portfolio. I then presented Marcus Thorne's signed and stamped structural analysis. Every beam, every join, every load-bearing wall was accounted for and verified by our own head of engineering. I slid a copy of the report down the polished table to Mr. Abernathy. Finch was stunned into silence. He looked at the report, at Marcus's signature, and then at me. It was a look of pure, undiluted betrayal. He had been so focused on me, the sentimental junior, that he never imagined a man like Marcus, a pragmatist, a man of concrete and steel, would ever be on my side. Just as he was about to erupt again, Mr. Abernathy's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his eyebrows shooting up. He cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, this is interesting. I've just received an email from Elias Vance. He says he's been briefed on an exciting new proposal for the Argent Tower, a proposal that his Preservation Society would be prepared to wholeheartedly and publicly endorse. He's attaching a press release, ready to go, pending our decision." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of a chessboard being flipped. Finch's entire strategy was predicated on the public being his enemy. In the span of 10 minutes, I had shown the board a plan that was cheaper, more beautiful, structurally sound, and now it came with the endorsement of the very man who had been their chief tormentor. Finch stared at me, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He saw his control, his power, his entire reality, dissolving in the light of the projector. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a king in a castle that was no longer his. The takeover wasn't loud or violent. It was a quiet, precise dismantling of his power, piece by piece, right in front of his eyes. The motion to dissolve the company was never made. Instead, Mr. Abernathy made a new motion to table the vote indefinitely, pending a full review of what he called Miss Reed's remarkable proposal. The motion passed unanimously, except for Finch, who just sat there, defeated and silent. The board meeting ended not with a bang, but with a stunned, contemplative quiet. The immediate threat of dissolution was gone, but the firm was now suspended in a state of limbo. Finch stormed out of the room without a word, his shoulders slumped. The other board members huddled around the table, speaking in low, urgent tones, passing Marcus's structural report and Elias Vance's email, back and forth like holy relics. They were looking at my renderings, not as art, but as a lifeline. I quietly packed up my portfolio and left. The first move had been made. Now, I had to let the consequences ripple outward, and they did. The news of a potential new direction for the Argent Tower project, one that involved preservation, leaked. Elias Vance, true to his word, was a master strategist. He didn't release his full-throated endorsement, but he allowed calculated whispers to spread through the city's political and media circles. He spoke to a key journalist about a promising dialogue and a potential third way. The public narrative began to shift. The protests didn't stop, but their tone changed from pure anger to cautious optimism. The name Finch and Associates was still toxic, but now it was attached to a new, intriguing possibility. This shift was all it took for the investors to come sniffing around again. The ones who had pulled their funding weren't sentimentalists. They were pragmatists. They hadn't fled because they hated brutalism. They had fled because they hated bad PR and financial risk. Now, they saw a project that could potentially deliver a huge PR victory and a unique, high-value property. The calls started coming in, but they weren't for Harrison Finch. Mr. Abernathy told me his phone was ringing off the hook with investors and city council members asking about the preservation architect and her integrated design. I was no longer Samantha Reed, the junior architect. I was a concept, a solution, a name being whispered in the corridors of power. The client exodus I had feared for the firm began to reverse, but with a crucial difference. They weren't returning to Finch. They were being drawn to my vision. The power base was shifting, not by force, but by the gravitational pull of a better idea. Finch saw it happening. He saw his life's work, his legacy, being rewritten by the very person he had dismissed as irrelevant. His panic, which had been a hot, explosive anger in the boardroom, now curdled into a cold, desperate cunning. He cornered me 2 days after the meeting, near the coffee machine. It was early in the morning, the office still quiet. He dispensed with the pleasantries. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice a low hiss. "Using company resources, my company's data, to build your little fantasy project. My lawyers will have a field day with you. You'll be lucky to design a garden shed after they're done with you." It was a predictable move, a threat. I didn't flinch. I just took a slow sip of my coffee. All the key design work was done on my own time, on my own equipment, with my own licensed software. "Mr. Finch," I said, my voice level. "The only company resources I used was the raw geotechnical survey data, an asset that you were about to liquidate for pennies on the dollar in a bankruptcy. I'd argue I didn't steal it. I salvaged it. I'm sure the board and our newly interested investors would see it the same way." His face tightened. He saw that threat was a dead end, so he switched tactics. The desperate counter-offer. His tone changed, becoming unnervingly smooth, conspiratorial. "Look, Samantha," he said, leaning closer. "I may have been hard on you. I push people. It's how I get the best out of them. But I always knew you had this in you. This fire, this vision. The board is weak. They don't understand what it takes. But you and I, we do." He smiled, a grotesque imitation of warmth. "We can do this together. A partnership. Finch and Reed. We'll reshape this entire firm around your vision. We'll be unstoppable." It was the most audacious, most insulting moment of my entire career. After 5 years of public humiliation, of being treated like an intellectual gnat, he was now offering to share the throne he was about to lose anyway. He wasn't offering me a partnership. He was offering me his chains, hoping I'd help him lock them back onto the company. I looked at him, at his desperate, pleading eyes, and I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet, clinical clarity. It was like observing a specimen under a microscope. "The time for a partnership with you, Mr. Finch, passed a long time ago," I said. "If it ever existed at all, I have a different vision for this firm's future, and it's a vision that you are simply not a part of." I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink, placed the cup in the dishwasher, and walked back to my desk, leaving him standing there, alone in the wreckage of his own making. The power shift was complete. He had tried threats, and he had tried flattery. He had nothing left. The final board meeting was a formality. It took place a week after my initial presentation. The atmosphere was entirely different. The desperation was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused energy. My portfolio sat at the center of the table, now filled with letters of support from community groups, enthusiastic preliminary quotes from my network of suppliers, and a revised, even more profitable financial model that incorporated the benefits of the positive press. The board voted. It was a series of swift, unanimous decisions. First, to formally scrap the monolith project. Second, to approve my integrated design for the Argent Tower, effective immediately. Third, to name me as the lead architect and project director for the new Argent build. And fourth, the one that sealed Finch's fate, they voted to create a new executive leadership position, Chief Design Officer, responsible for overseeing the firm's new direction, a direction they were calling Continuum Architecture, a direction they offered to me. Finch sat through it all, stone-faced. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He just absorbed each vote like a physical blow. When the meeting was adjourned, he stood up, collected his papers, and walked out of the room without looking at anyone. His removal wasn't a dramatic firing. It was an organizational tide that had simply risen and swept him out to sea. His power at the firm had been so absolute, so tied to his personal vision that when that vision was rejected, there was nothing of him left. He was irrelevant. The firm had been rebuilt around a principle he could not grasp. My final confrontation with him, if you can even call it that, happened the next day. I was walking past his corner office. The door was open. He was packing his belongings into a cardboard box. His awards, his framed magazine covers, his scale models of cold concrete towers. They looked like relics from a forgotten civilization. He saw me in the doorway. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked tired and empty. All that work, he muttered, more to himself than to me. A lifetime building a reputation for strength, and it's all brought down by sentimental nonsense. I paused, leaning against the doorframe. I thought of all the times he'd used those words to wound me. Now he was using them as a shield, a final, pathetic excuse for his own failure to see the future. It wasn't nonsense, Mr. Finch, I said, my voice quiet but clear. It was value. You just didn't know how to measure it. Sentiment is what makes a building a landmark. Sentiment is what makes a city a home. Sentiment is what builds a legacy. You built blocks of concrete. We're going to build a future. I didn't wait for a reply. I just turned and walked away. There was nothing more to say. The new reality began to take shape. The firm was rebranded as Continuum Architects. The name was my idea. It signified our new philosophy. We didn't destroy the past to make way for the future. We created a continuum between them. My first act as Chief Design Officer was to promote Marcus Thorne to Chief Technical Officer. His loyalty and expertise were the steel that had reinforced my vision. We brought in a new CEO, a woman recommended by Mr. Abernathy, who understood that a company's culture was its most important asset. 6 months later, I was standing on the observation deck of a building across the street from the Argent Tower construction site. The old terracotta facade was encased in a protective scaffolding, where skilled artisans were painstakingly restoring it. Behind it, the new steel framework of the tower was rising, its lines graceful and clean against the blue sky. It looked exactly like my rendering. Marcus stood beside me, holding a rolled-up blueprint. He nodded towards the site. "It's got good bones, Sam," he said, with a rare smile. "Yes, it does," I replied, feeling a profound sense of peace. Down on the street below, a tour group was stopped in front of the site. The guide, I was surprised and delighted to see, was Elias Vance. He was pointing up at the rising structure, his voice animated, telling the story of the building that was almost lost, and the new vision that had saved it. He was now our biggest advocate. He was selling our story for us. That evening, I sat in my new office. It was Finch's old corner office, but I had redesigned it completely. The heavy, dark furniture was gone, replaced with light wood and glass. On the wall, where his self-aggrandizing awards used to hang, there was only one thing, a simple framed photo of the Argent Tower, taken on the day its landmark status was restored. It was a reminder not of a victory, but of a responsibility. It wasn't about revenge. It was never about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about building something that would last. So I want to speak to you directly for a moment. To everyone who has ever been told their passion is a waste of time. To everyone who has been dismissed, belittled, or made to feel small because your ideas don't fit into a pre-approved box. They will call your dedication obsession. They will call your principles naive. They will call your passion sentimental nonsense. They will do this because your vision challenges their comfortable, limited reality. They do it because creation is always a threat to those who only know how to control or destroy. Do not let their lack of imagination dim your light. Your passion is not your weakness. It is your blueprint. Your sentiment is not your liability. It is your compass. The things you pour your heart into, the work you do in secret when no one is watching, that is your true portfolio. That is your real value. Don't wait for them to recognize it. Build your own foundation. Draft your own future. Be ready. Because one day the structure they built on arrogance and dismissal will begin to crumble. And when it does, the world won't need another person with a plan to demolish it. It will need you with your blueprint for how to build it back. better. My story isn't really about architecture. It's about the architecture of self-respect. It's about understanding that the most important structure you will ever build is your own life, on your own terms. It was never about getting even with Mr. Finch. It was about proving that a better way was possible. It was about proving that creation is always, always more powerful than destruction. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you felt your passion was underestimated. Let's share our stories. And if you want to hear more, make sure you share this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps to know we're all building something together.